Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the NAI's latest panel discussion. As usual, we wish we could be seeing you all in person. Alas, we cannot, and we will just continue to settle for Zoom, but we're delighted you can join us. So happy to have you here today and eventually to see you all in person. As the title of today's panel highlights, today's discussion will focus on location data and particularly various uses of location data, also known as precise location information and precise geolocation data. And at the center of this discussion today, particularly, will be certain sharing practices, those that were revealed in a series of articles by the Wall Street Journal, where certain companies have been found to be sharing data, selling data, consumer location information to law enforcement and surveillance agencies. So the Wall Street Journal and the lead reporter on this series, Byron Tau, deserve a lot of credit for investigating these practices and shining a light on them, raising some concerns, and doing so in a very responsible and, I believe, balanced way. And I think it's been a very valuable commitment to the discussion and industry practices. These practices particularly have led to, have had a number of outcomes, including an investigation by the US Congress into the practices of certain agencies and the practices of certain businesses. Questions and queries from the Federal Trade Commission, though I'm not currently aware of any type of official investigation. Certainly queries there, and queries from other members of Congress outside of the formal investigation to companies and others, an urging of the FTC to look into this issue. So it's very important, and it's one where NAI shares the concerns. We share the concerns for consumers about misuse of data, as that's something that we've always sought to prevent. And we also share the concerns of where this could end up. You know, at the end of the day, practices that are so potentially harmful for consumers could really lead to limits on other uses that are benign and even beneficial. The marketing and advertising uses that NAI members rely on, they're leaders in providing. So that's also at the core of the discussion today. In response to the revelations earlier this year, the NAI put out a best practices document that highlighted a series of considerations that companies should go through if and when considering to share consumer location information or precise location information beyond advertising and marketing purposes for which they were collected. So we believe this is a very valuable element to the discussion, and hope the document provides good guidance to companies and can help steer this conversation. And that's something that we will discuss a good amount in the panel today. So we are very proud. I mentioned Byron a moment ago, Byron Tau, who is the reporter at the Wall Street Journal, leading this series of articles and these revelations, will be our moderator today. We're very proud to have him. He's a reporter in the Journal's Washington Bureau, covering primarily the Justice Department and the FBI. And prior to joining the Wall Street Journal, was a reporter at Politico, has deep political and policy experience. We're also joined on the panel today by Gerald Smith, who's the Vice President of Privacy at Cuebiq. In addition to being a leading member, Cuebiq also maintains a Data for Good program, and is a leader in sharing location data for a number of purposes that are well-intended outside of advertising and marketing purposes. And Gerald will have a chance to talk about that today. We've also got on our panel today Jessica Rich. And Jessica, who most of you probably know, is currently a distinguished fellow at the Georgetown University School of Law, Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. But most of you probably know Jessica most for her role as a former head of the FTC's Bureau of Consumer Protection, And also after that, the Vice President of Consumer Policy for Consumer Reports. So Jessica is one of the foremost experts in the area of consumer protection and privacy, and we'll be bringing that perspective to this discussion, which is very valuable. And we're all joined by Meredith Halama, who's a partner at Perkins Coie and is the firm-wide co-chair on the ad tech privacy and data management practice. So Meredith has a lot of experience working with companies and providing guidance and counsel to companies on their data practices. Last but certainly not least, someone who needs no introduction to this group, Leigh Freund, who is the president and CEO of NAI, will be on our panel rounding it out today. So with that, I would like to again thank everyone for joining us and turn it on over to Byron. Byron.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. Just a quick high-level summary of what I've been reporting on before we jump right into this. I've basically found that there's a somewhat secretive pipeline of this kind of geolocation data to the military, intelligence, and law enforcement agencies of the federal government, sold by either specialized brokers or by commercial brokers to government contractors. That consumers are largely in the dark about what kind of apps are collecting this data and transmitting it, and that there's little explicit notice to consumers in privacy policies that national security entities may be obtaining this data. And in addition, there's obviously been a ton of reporting on the explosion of interest in using this kind of data for contact tracing and public health. So with that as the backdrop, let's turn to Leigh to set the big picture stage here. I think a lot of participants in this call are familiar with the industry, but if there are any lay people out there, can you give us a very high level overview about what is this data, what's it drawn from, and how, what does it look like? What does this industry look like?
Yeah, thanks, Byron. And thanks so much for spending some time with us today, and as well as to all of our distinguished panelists. I hope to not do most of the talking because we have many experts on this panel. But yes, I'd be happy to set the table. So as most of you know well, digital advertising companies collect all kinds of different types of data to inform tailored advertising. Browsing history, offline data, express preferences by consumers, et cetera. But Byron's reporting and the topic of our discussion today generally covers location data. So companies in our membership collect and use location data in a number of different ways. They can use aggregated, grouped, grouped data. So in Byron's context of this type of data being used for law enforcement or immigration purposes, you could use the example of you can see that phones are crossing the Mexico-US border at a certain location, but you don't have any information about who belongs to those phones or any other identifying information. You can use generalized location data, such as some of our companies use polygons or geographic areas or grouped retail locations like coffee shops or a Starbucks. And then I think relevant to this conversation is the use of something that we have defined as precise location data. And even when companies use or obtain precise location data, they can and do sometimes render that data imprecise so that it can't be identified. And the NAI has years before issued some groundbreaking guidance on how to do that so that you can continue to use location data without compromising privacy. Excuse me, this is why I have handy dandy water here. The use of precise location data requires consent under the code, and I think it is generally an accepted industry in the practice that it requires consent. But we think that as we look at the history of the use of location data, certainly one, it is more prevalent, and two, it is becoming, we kind of in our investigation found that it's unclear what that consent is for. Are we using Are we, go back to the old flashlight case from the FTC many years ago, excuse me, is it being used in a way that I wouldn't expect or understand? Is it traditionally only used for tailored advertising purposes? And as these non-advertising purposes become more prevalent, we kind of, in holistically thinking about the NAI code, modified the requirement for obtaining consent for the use of precise location data, and created guidelines that require companies to have just-in-time consent for not only, and we could get into this in more detail, but for not only marketing uses, which the code had traditionally only covered uses for tailored advertising, but in addition, you must disclose in that just-in-time notice the non-marketing uses that you are going to be potentially using, not only for yourself, but for your downstream partners. So a direct attempt to get at exactly what Byron has been reporting on, which is unanticipated, unintended, unknown uses of location data beyond traditional advertising. And we thought that there was a gap in the code that didn't address that. So our new guidance does that. And it, it is meant to give the companies pause in terms of really thinking through what responsible data use is and how they should be doing it. Long ago when I was in-house, I used to always say to sales folks who wanted to advertise, specific things, how would you defend it if our company was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, as being in this part of the advertising business? And if you are safe, defending that, then, maybe we can talk further. But it is meant to be a start in the right direction. I think there's a lot more to be done with data location in the advertising space, but that is kind of just a brief overview of what our code requires and kind of what we've done recently.
So let's start at the company level. Meredith, you're an attorney in private practice. You deal a lot with companies in this space. What kind of policies and best practices can companies implement on their own to protect the privacy of consumers who may or may not be aware just how much information is collected off of their devices?
Yeah, thank you, Byron, and thanks to the NAI for having me here today. And, I would say, of course, just to kind of level set, that there are a lot of different companies involved in any particular bit of data collection. And so I think that what best practices are depend on where you sit. So if you're an OS manufacturer, for instance, you can make it easy for apps to say why they're asking for consent. You can make it easy for consumers to withdraw consent. And of course, Apple and Google have been moving in that direction. And, according to some accounts, Apple's changes have probably already had a bigger impact than any regulation could have. Then going down a level, if you're an app, you can not ask for access to location information unless you need it for the functionality of your app. You can use the OS level provided prompts. You can supplement them as needed to make that really clear. And if you don't need location for the functionality of your app, if, for instance, the reason you're asking for permission is because that's the only way to keep your app free, then you can make that really clear that you're collecting it for advertising purposes and that you are going to share it with third parties for that purpose as the NAI requires. And then finally, if you're a third party, if you're in the NAI membership, for instance, you don't have that ability to ask consumers, for consent to collect. You don't have the ability to communicate directly with them. But what you can do is ask the apps that you work with to get consent for what you want to do, again, as the NAI requires. But I would argue that that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more you can do on the back end to protect consumers' privacy. So first of all, minimize retention. If you don't need to keep the precise location information, get rid of it. To de-identify or aggregate the data, many beneficial uses of location information don't require the IDFA, for instance. So delete it. That's, of course, not the end of the analysis when it comes to location information. There's more you need to do to properly de-identify. I know we're going to talk about that more. be careful about how you're sharing that data, because it's great that you're protecting it, but if you then are sharing that data with third parties without any kind of knowledge or oversight of what they might do, then your privacy protections are largely falling apart. And then finally, making sure that you use the data for the purpose for which it was collected, barring proper legal process or the like.
Gerald, you two are in the trenches at the corporate level here. What are things that either your company is doing in this space to protect consumer privacy, or that you're seeing in the wider industry?
Yeah, thank you, Byron, and thanks to the NAI for having me here today. I think there's a number of things that you can do as a company. Meredith touched on several of those. I think where you start is with transparency. It's a core value at Cuebiq. You'll hear it talked about by the NAI quite a bit. But ultimately, you need to lead with making users aware of what you're doing, what data you're collecting, and how that will be used. Leigh mentioned the just-in-time notice. That is an opportunity for a consent event, which is how Cuebiq addresses this. And this is not specifically in reference to the OS consent, but there's an opportunity for applications to also gather informed consent, which is how we do it at Cuebiq. And that is where you must lay out specific use cases to the user so that they can make a meaningful and informed choice. So however you plan on using that data, or your partners plan on using it downstream, that is where you need to make that disclosure. Additionally, you can take that a step further, as we do at Cuebiq, and get named consent, where we have our partners, our application publishers that we work with, list Cuebiq specifically, or list that they work with partners, along with a link to a page where they can gather information about those partners. And they can interrogate not only the app publisher's privacy policy, but also the privacy policy of partners like Cuebiq, so that the customer or the user is presented with enough information initially to know what they're consenting to and how that data will be used, but has the opportunity to take that a step further and learn more information before they make that informed choice. Beyond that, I think it's, as the NAI has laid out in their guidelines and code of conduct, and is widely held best practice and necessary, is to give the user control. So you need to provide the user with the ability to opt out and to withdraw that consent at any time. So they're not making a choice, in the moment and having to live with that choice forever, right? We provide multiple channels where the user can opt out, either via the Cuebiq app, the TrustArc app, via many of our partner apps have the ability to opt out within, and we feel that it's important to make multiple easy channels available so that the customer can exercise that choice. Additionally, privacy by design is something, it gets kicked around a lot, but at Cuebiq, it's something that from day one, we've implemented into our company culture. And this is all about thinking about user privacy from the time you conceptualize the product, right? And building that in through the life cycle of development to make sure you're thinking about customer and user touch points. And you're thinking about what data will be collected, how that will be shared, and how you can be transparent with the user so they can make that informed choice.
I'll bring you into this discussion because a lot of the companies that are in the location data product space don't necessarily have a one-to-one relationship with consumers. So on this notion of consumer consent and notice, are consumers really being given fair notice and choice in the collection of data from their phones? And what more can be done to give them control, to make sure they understand how data flows in this ecosystem, and to make sure they understand all the implications of privacy policies?
Well, thanks, Byron, and thanks for those wonderful articles you did that exposed something that many have feared and suspected, but had all the facts there. And I also, thanks for having me on this panel. And I do think that what NAI has done and what Gerald and Meredith have described are good starts. However, I think my job on this panel is to come at it from the consumer perspective and to give the industry the tough love I've enjoyed giving them all these years. So I'm going to criticize the basic scheme that we're all talking about, which is there's no law requiring notice and choice industry-wide. So to the extent it's given, it doesn't provide protections across the industry. And for consumers, unless everybody's abiding by a scheme, there's going to be holes in it and they're not going to be protected. The notice and choice that does exist is largely illusory. Notice and choice just really doesn't work for consumers. We've learned that in the 20 years we've lived with it. Consumers, they turn on location services because they want to use their maps or something that directly relates to location. They don't realize that this means hundreds of companies could be getting their location data either at that time or as it flows through the chain. And to really know what's going on, they would need to find and potentially read hundreds of legalese, fine print privacy policies on their mobile phones to really know what's going on. And then they basically can't stop most of it. Maybe some companies, would give them some sort of choice that they could exercise on a company by company basis. So this is not working for consumers. I also want to point out that the premise of this panel is that marketing use is somehow primary, benign, something consumers all know about, and government use is the thing that's secret and in the background and dangerous and invisible. But from consumers' perspective, all of this is opaque because of the very reasons I described. There's all these companies getting in the marketing space and they have no idea, and many of these companies are invisible to them. We know from surveys that consumers are concerned not just about government use, they're concerned about company use. We see that over and over, and they're just as distrustful of companies as the government. The location data is highly sensitive. It can reveal their comings and goings. It can threaten their safety. It can reveal their religion by the places they go, their politics, their health, all their personal habits. It can get into the hands of insurers and employers, creditors, the government without due process. We know that consumers were unwilling to use health apps, COVID apps, because they didn't trust who would get the data. So we saw a concrete example of that. So my view is that we really need to get away as much as possible from notice and choice and move towards legally enforceable standards about what uses are okay, they're benign, maybe you could still have notice and choice for those, but what uses are just forbidden or need subpoenas or just out of the question. This is good for consumers, and it would be good for legitimate businesses too, for the reason that were outlined at the outset, that this whole house of cards could come down if we don't get some rules in place.
Thank you for that. And just a reminder to those watching, we will be taking questions and answers in the last 15 minutes, so please stick around. We'll get to regulation in a second, but let's paint the broadest possible picture here of all the alternative uses, because it's not all doom and gloom. It's not all immigration enforcement. There are kind of quote unquote good uses for this data and what some might call bad uses for this data. So let's get into the uses of this data outside of the advertising context. Gerald, can this data be used for good? And what does that look like? And I know good is subjective, but can this data outside of advertising be used to improve people's lives, government services, and generally speaking, be applied to solving problems in society?
Absolutely, Byron. And I'll give you some examples of our Data for Good program, which we're very proud of. It utilizes aggregate anonymized data. It predates 2020, but there's been a heightened focus on it in 2020 due to COVID and the response to COVID. So many of you may have heard the name Cuebiq mentioned by many national media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, for our mobility index, as well as our economic reopening index or shelter in place index. What all of these have been able to do is take mobility data and utilize it in a way that is useful for our partners, which include the Center for Disease Control, UNICEF, Oxford University, and use it in an aggregate privacy compliant way to show how people are and are not moving around the country at a time when that's extremely important, right? When we have shelter in place orders and those kind of things, this is providing data that without the mobility data that we've been able to provide, these insights wouldn't be possible. I'll give you a couple others, non-COVID related. One is for natural disasters. During data we gathered around Hurricane Harvey was used by the University of Washington so that they could analyze how people moved before, during, and after a natural disaster so that they could use those insights to help first responders in preparing for the next disaster. We've also been able to provide via our partners information on what gas stations are open to FEMA so that they can help people as they're evacuating. And finally, one of a really interesting use case is one that in partnership with MIT that created the MIT Inequality Atlas, where they're able to take information about neighborhoods and streets and be able to use this data to determine how the types of businesses actually impacts the economic demographics. So I think we're just scratching the surface on how this data can be used in innovative ways. And that's why we very much support free and open sharing.
And if I would be remiss, Byron, if I didn't add on to Gerald's very good list, the Federation for Internet Alerts, which many of our member companies are participating in and use precise location data to serve missing child alerts, Amber Alerts, as well as severe weather warnings in areas where television use is not, we used to always receive our tornado warnings or severe thunderstorm warnings by the beeps on the television, but as broadcast television is declining, it's a really important piece of technology that, that many of our members are using data for.
So right now the industry is currently self-regulated, but there's a lot of chatter in Washington about potential congressional action, some sort of federal privacy law or other ways of tackling the flows of data. And so, Leigh, let's turn to you. You're the president of a national trade association that monitors these things. Is regulation coming? And will Congress ultimately need to write the rules of the road around a lot of these questions?
Yeah, well, we certainly hope it's coming. I think, for the first time in a long time, I think privacy advocates, government, and industry are all aligned on that, 100%. We may differ about what we want in that legislation, but the concept of federal comprehensive privacy legislation and rules of the road that are consistent and clear are vital for our industry. We have, and that sounds weird coming from a person who manages a self-regulatory program, but I will say, we hear loud and clear Jessica's primary complaint about self-regulation in that, okay, you have 100 members, that's 85 or 90% of the industry. That doesn't account for good responsible behavior by the rest of the industry. And frankly, that sometimes is disadvantage of companies who are trying to do the responsible things with respect to privacy, because they are saying no to perhaps riskier opportunities with more invasive uses of data that other companies are gladly taking. And so, we would applaud that. And I think self-regulation, first of all, I think we have been super impactful and valuable in establishing what even some privacy advocates will acknowledge and point to as best practices, particularly with respect to precise location information. The guidance that we issued years ago is still cited by the FTC and others as the primary means of rendering precise location imprecise. We just need more of the industry to follow it. and to prevent these inefficiencies in the marketplace. So we certainly hope that there is privacy legislation. I think Jessica also spoke to the the lack of optimal uses of notice and choice, and that it doesn't really work. So we welcome the discussion. We think that the NAI has done a pretty good job of kind of laying the groundwork for sensitive data requirements for uses of sensitive data, getting consumers to consent. But we do agree that there are certain things that should not be done with that data. And we can, I'm sure, get into that discussion, but we believe that we should have that very difficult conversation with our member companies, and let's not do the things that we shouldn't be doing so that we can preserve the benign as well as the good uses for the rest of our industry.
Jessica, you have been in government and been a regulator on some of these issues. Let's go into the details here. What do you think a comprehensive federal privacy law or something more narrowly tailored just at geolocation should look like? What should be included? What are the flashpoints and the big issues that Congress needs to address here?
So in all of the hearings Congress has had, well, I've been dealing with this issue for 20 years. There's been a debate about whether to have comprehensive privacy legislation, and we keep discussing it and we keep having hearings. In the last few years, the hearings have all been about how we need to move beyond notice and choice. But every piece of legislation that is circulated all still is based on notice and choice, even though the press releases herald them as not being based on notice and choice. I think what we need is, especially as we've seen the flaws with notice and choice that I pointed out, is a more comprehensive scheme that says how you can use certain data and how you can't, so consumers are protected and the burden isn't on them to read hundreds of privacy policies and then supposedly exercise choice one by one with each of these companies. So so for government use, right now you've got a Supreme Court opinion saying there needs to be a subpoena when the government gets location data and other sensitive data, and that should apply regardless of whether it's from the cell phone companies or bought from marketers. And I think there's a bill to that effect going to be circulated soon by Senator, who is it that
Wyden, I believe.
Wyden, that's right, Wyden. I'm not sure the bill is out, but he's announced it. As to on the commercial side, and actually, part of what you did was expose that the commercial and the national security side aren't so different, but I think there needs to be a clear scheme about how you can use data and how you can't, rather than putting it all on the consumer. So if you had a strong, clear law, you could allow some of these wonderful uses with aggregated data without companies having to worry about it. You could allow it subject to certain terms. You could allow various benign uses in marketing, maybe with choice, but you could outlaw other uses. Like, for example, you shouldn't be able to buy data to get around the consumer reporting laws, for example. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act says you have to jump through these hoops if you're going to make decisions about employment, insurance, and other important decisions about consumers. But companies can buy a lot of information outside of the outside of the consumer credit laws and make those decisions anyway. And so we need to close that loophole. You shouldn't be able to buy data to get around the civil rights laws in the same way. So you shouldn't be able to buy data, surmise race, religion, and other characteristics based on this data, and then use it to make decisions that would violate the civil rights laws. You shouldn't, as a data broker, be able to sell data to any comer. You should have to do some vetting to ensure that you're not selling it for some of these purposes I just discussed. There needs to be a hurdle there, a due diligence there. Maybe we should consider banning ads based on, serious health conditions or certain really sensitive information. And we also talked about aggregate data. Maybe there should be, a company should have to demonstrate that it couldn't use aggregate data to perform the function that it performed, and it had to use, personal identifiable data, even for these benign purposes, to push people more towards aggregate data. So that's an example of where you can start separating benign practices from harmful practices and getting a scheme in place that everyone could understand.
Meredith, can I bring you in on this? We have two big regulatory regimes right now, GDPR in Europe and California's CCPA. How have clients been navigating both of those regimes? And are there any lessons learned that Congress should consider in looking at a potentially federal privacy law? Is there anything that they can take away from how clients have had any difficulties or any problems in dealing with both of those regulatory regimes?
Yeah, so I would say that probably the GDPR might be a better model for this particular issue set that we're talking about today, in terms of thinking about things like purpose limitation, right? Like, why was the data collected, and let's not use it for other purposes. The CCPA doesn't have quite that same notion. Instead, it has a broad opt-out of sale, which arguably might give consumers the ability to opt out of the disclosure of certain of this data for particular purposes. But I think, at least in the mobile app space, is very much of it in its infancy and really unclear as to whether it's giving consumers the control that the drafters were looking for. So I think, though, that the GDPR, though, and this notion about thinking about the uses and needing to be transparent about it and kind of responsible data use, is one that can and should really inform a discussion of federal privacy legislation broadly.
We're going to go to questions in about 5 minutes. So, start to think about what you might want to ask, and please ask that in the chat. But let's talk about the idea of anonymization or pseudonymization. Location is so very personal in a lot of ways that there are questions about whether it can truly be aggregated. I believe there was an MIT paper back in 2013, I think, called Unique in a Crowd, that basically said 4 data points were enough to identify 95% of people. They were so unique, they were such a unique fingerprint that it was, that basically their patterns in the world gave away who they were. So Gerald, is it possible to have anonymized or pseudonymized location data, just given the type of data set it is? And if yes, can you walk us through how that is done?
Sure. Yeah, it's absolutely possible. There's multiple techniques involved, and the quality of whether or not that data is anonymous or aggregate is going to depend on the techniques applied to it, right? So there's multiple ways of doing it. You talked about aggregation. You can aggregate and group together data into minimum sample sizes. And you can do this in a way so that no individual can be identified, but there has to be a framework that you follow so that you're not just lumping, I think you mentioned 4 people into a category. You need to think through your process and think contextually about the data that you're working with, and think downstream how it could be re-identified, and then base how many individuals are in the group that you aggregate, or what types of data you leave in the set when you group it together. And so there's not just one number that you can say this is when it's aggregated, right? There's a thought process, and this is part of privacy by design, is thinking about if you don't want the data to be re-identified, there's steps you take to do that from a technology perspective. You also mentioned pseudonymization, removing direct identifiers so that it's less likely to be re-identified. We work with mobile advertising IDs a lot in advertising. You can take that a step further, as we do it at Cuebiq, and assign it an internal ID so that it's another step removed. You've also got differential privacy, which is probably a deep dive topic for another panel. But in short, you can look at the way that the queries are performed on the data, and limit the way that that happens so that re-identification becomes less likely, and you get into concepts like k-anonymity and other things for another day. You can also do things like up-leveling, which is if you identify a user's home location, you can transform that into a zip code or a census block group, which we're very fortunate in the US to have a great census system where you will have a minimum of 600 individuals in a census block group, all the way up to 3,000. So at Cuebiq, that's how we would transform a location if it's identified as being someone's home, which we do not want to include in our data set. We'll up-level that so that it downstream that users, location can't be identified.
Can I just add to that, Byron, just a little bit? I would say, generally what we hear from companies is that most companies don't really want the responsibility of having identified or personal data, and they are happy to anonymize, aggregate, de-identify, pseudonymize, whatever you will. I think the conversation, though, around the solutions here needs to be much broader, because all of those privacy-friendly tools and their use can really be tempered by the role of advertiser demand for more data-driven insights that can justify their expenditure on some of these advertising products, right? So I think we need to include advertisers, brands, agencies into the conversation so that we can understand if we're being asked to do the right thing in terms of privacy, that the entire marketplace understands those limitations.
Jessica, do you want to chime in on this? Are those steps enough to protect consumers' privacy when you're talking about geolocation data?
Sorry, I was on mute. Well, I think Gerald was talking about that some steps are a lot more robust than others, and that simple, I don't know if he said it like this, but simple pseudonymization, where you're using an ID, can be reverse engineered. And in order to really have protections, you need more robust aggregation that can't be reverse engineered so easily. So there have been a lot of concerns about any kinds of exceptions or carve out for pseudonymous data as opposed to aggregate data, which is more protected. And while it's better to use synonymous data than a whole big profile, the dangers of allowing that may be
I think we lost Jessica a little bit there. So we're going to turn to questions from the audience, and hopefully her connection will stabilize. This is from Alan Gibby, and it's directed at Gerald, but perhaps we could also bring Meredith in on it after. Alan asks, what is Cuebiq's process for determining whether a specific new use case of location data is one that the company should implement?
Okay, well, you have to review who your partners are, what the data is going to be used for. So if it's a specific new use, I can't comment specifically on what that would be without knowing, but we would always do evaluate all of our partners, right? Before we engage in any kind of an agreement or partnership or explore working with them, we want to understand what are they going to use the data for? Where will it go downstream? Once we understand that and are comfortable with that, then we craft a contract that says this is how the data will be used. And that data it must be used in compliance with how we disclose to users what the uses will be downstream. So if it doesn't match those use cases, that's really a non-starter for us. But ultimately, this is about it's about a privacy-forward approach that Cuebiq takes to make sure that we're respecting the user, we're being transparent with how data is used, and that compliance flows through from our partners downstream, upstream, downstream, that we have the entire lineage of the data laid out for a user to view in our privacy policy and understand how their data is being used.
One of the things
I'll just be quick, since you lost me.
Sorry about, yeah, go ahead.
I was warning about the dangers of pseudonymized data, which, as you pointed out in all of your articles, and every single one, I think, can be reverse engineered by various marketers and the government.
One of the things I found in my reporting is that some of the providers of location data products either aren't asking clients too many questions about the use cases, or the clients aren't being exactly straightforward about what they're doing with it. So Meredith, let's turn to you. You help companies navigate this space. Is that a challenge? And to Alan's question, what do you advise them as a process in determining whether a use case is allowable?
Yeah, so, maybe to the second question, I think, is easier because it's a lot of what Gerald said, is evaluating kind of when you do know who you're dealing with. But the first question, I think, is actually quite a bit more challenging. And I think it really is hard. To set the scene, I don't really think that there's just sort of like a don't ask, don't tell, we want to make a deal, we'll sell our data to the highest bidder. These are companies, who participate in the NAI, who meet NAI standards, they meet CCPA, many meet EU requirements, and they have robust compliance programs, and they really take privacy seriously. But at the same time, we're ad tech experts. We can help you understand how a cookie translates to device ID and what have you. We are less equipped, for instance, to identify a potential government contractor, much less to then evaluate and understand a government use of data and be the arbiters of whether that should be allowed or not. And I would argue that everyone benefits if companies can share data with particular actors in ways that foster public safety, but that really kind of assumes that there are reasonable guardrails in place to prevent abuses, and that the ad tech industry, that me as I advise my clients, and even Gerald and his company, should not be the ones to kind of determine rules of the road for government use of data. We have other laws where we determine that, things like the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA, and I'm not suggesting that ECPA is the exact model that we should use for location data, but I am suggesting that location data can be every bit as sensitive as that data, and we would never ask providers of electronic communication services to self-regulate themselves. And I think it's a lot that we ask the ad tech industry to be the ones to do this analysis and then figure out what they want to allow and not allow.
We have time for a couple more questions, so if you have any, please submit them through the chat. We have one from Jeannie Barton, who asks, what will it take to get a federal privacy law passed? And would a bill focused specifically on the limited use of location data sharing with state and federal health authorities be a useful step or a distraction to a passage of this kind of privacy law? Leigh, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I think, we've seen limited success with trying to siphon off individual pieces of a comprehensive privacy bill. I point to data breach notification law that we have not been able to get passed for many, many years. In fact, I think it's in the multiple decades at this point. So I think there is some value in trying to take individual pieces. I think there was even an attempt throughout the COVID pandemic on Capitol Hill to try to, delineate kind of COVID relief data uses from regular data uses. I think it doesn't solve the issues that that we seem to agree are prevalent among the industry in terms of the way we use data, the clarity with which we use data, and whether or not consumers should consent to it or opt in or out to it. So I think in order for the overall issue to be solved, I think we do need to think about a comprehensive framework, and whether or not, we pass individual pieces that are based on that overall framework piecemeal would be fine, but I think we need to lay out the framework. And Jessica wants to answer.
I have a strong reaction to this one, which is that it's been 20 years and every now and then Congress satisfies itself by passing some sort of narrow sectoral law, and then the pressure's off to really grapple with the issue of a comprehensive law. And in addition, so no, this would be a distraction. But in addition, if this is really a law to enable use of data rather than to protect data, which is how it would be perceived by many privacy proponents, it would be that much more destructive and controversial. Unlike some other sectoral laws, which are clearly designed to protect data, this would be designed to enable use of data in ways consumers may be uncomfortable with. So that would make it even worse. So I think at this point, it would be very much a bad distraction.
We have a question from Pollyanna Sanderson, who says that contact tracing apps have been mentioned as an example of a good and responsible use of this data-driven technology, though she wonders if the adoption of contact tracing has been undermined by sort of a chilling effect or trust-related issues that the tech industry at large is having. And so is there a chilling effect when government use cases are controversial, like say rounding up immigrants or using this for espionage? And does that undermine the capacity for these technologies to do good? Gerald, do you want to take this one?
Well, I don't know if there's a chilling effect on contact tracing or not. I mean, it's not something that we specialize in. I can say generally, I think that if we don't have effective self-regulation and if we don't address consumer concerns, then absolutely it could have a chilling effect across the board. And that's why I think it's so important that groups like the NAI that are taking the lead and companies that participate in it highlight this, follow the frameworks, and make best practices more widespread. I think ultimately the consumer and the market will decide. From a company's perspective, all I can say is that we try to do things the right way. We try to lead the way. We take a privacy first approach. We wish everyone else did, but all we can do is the best that we can do in private industry. And I can't speak for, how bad actors impact society at large.
Leigh, do you want to take a stab at this one? Are there trust issues related to big tech that are undermining the potential uses of this data for things that are far less controversial, like public health?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a trust issue, and we see it playing out today, even in politics, right? Some folks feel that big tech is biased against conservatives. Others feel exactly the opposite. Google is now being sued by the Justice Department. That's a whole separate panel. I think, so I do think there's a trust problem, and I think the techlash totally shows that. I think, though, that the way consumers act online is different than the expressed concerns. And I know what Jessica will say in response to that. That's because we don't do a good enough job explaining it, and people are tired of it, and they just want to use the app with the location, and so they'll say yes to anything. But I do think, I think there needs to be a technology-based solution in order to establish trust or reestablish trust, right? So self-regulation doesn't go far enough because we don't have 100% of the industry involved. Regulation might not even go far enough to establishing trust because we don't necessarily, between the FTC and self-regulation, I think there's roles for both in terms of enforcement, but we still might not get everything. So I do think that in order to establish trust with the consumers, there needs to be a technology component. We need to be able to shut down companies that are not acting with the public good in mind, or that are using data irresponsibly. I think we need a technology-based accountability system to help us with that.
One of the big controversies in the news is about TikTok, which is China's exploitation of its commercial data environment for surveillance and for the monitoring of its population. And on the other hand, you have the US, not quite articulating what it, what its vision of privacy in the 21st century is. Jessica, do you want to take this question on? What is the US conception of privacy? I mean, it seems like on the one hand, you have a very strong European set of rules. On the other hand, you have China, which is surveilling its population using its commercial data environment. What does it mean? What does privacy mean in the 21st century in America?
I think there is a uniform definition of privacy. It's pretty splintered in the United States. We've got in the commercial area, it's sort of data and device protection. In the Fourth Amendment, it's search and seizure. And then you've got abortion and gay rights being sort of in another category. So I don't think there is a unified vision of privacy. But I'll also say, as to TikTok, the US has been caught over and over using data for national security in ways that are undermining trust here. So you've got the articles you did, but you've also got the fact that Privacy Shield and before that Safe Harbor agreements were struck down because the US doesn't have a disciplined process over the way it gets data from commercial entities and uses it without any kind of limits. So there really isn't much of a concept of privacy on the national security side other than the Fourth Amendment, which, as you see, many government entities are getting around.
I would say that happens not only in the United States, however, so.
Oh yeah, right.
Meredith, do you want the last word? We have to wrap up, but do you want to take a stab on what privacy ought to look like in the 21st century?
I think to echo my prior remarks, it ought to have a notion of responsible data use. I agree with Jessica about moving away from notice and choice and not picking up and copying whole cloth the GDPR, but adopting that basic principle and weaving it throughout any and all legislation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think just to add, the sense of there's been a lot of talk recently about a duty of loyalty or a duty of care or a fiduciary duty to those who to whom we entrust our data, and it's an issue worth exploring as we think about this overall legislative landscape.
But it goes beyond data. It's
Fair
also
enough.
devices and systems. Yeah. So
I gestured and reached my cord. Sorry.
Yeah.
Seems like we're getting into some interesting territory. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So this has been a wonderful discussion. Thank you for letting me moderate. Thank you all for reading my reporting, and thank you for participating in this discussion. And really appreciate everyone's out there who tuned in, and thank you again.
Yeah, thanks very much, Byron. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.